November 20th, 1980, Louisiana. At 7 a.m., Lake Peigneur was a paradise, a shallow freshwater haven where locals fished and botanists tended to rare flowers. 3 hours later, it was hell on earth. In less than an afternoon, a terrifying vortex opened up in the center of the lake. It didn't just drain the water, it devoured everything. 65 acres of land, an entire oil rig, 11 massive barges, they were all pulled into the abyss. But the real horror wasn't on the surface. While the world collapsed above, 55 miners were trapped 400 meters below, in the dark, listening to the ceiling crack. They were inside a crystal coffin that was rapidly filling with water. This is the story of the most expensive calculation error in history. To understand the catastrophe, you have to understand the deception. On the surface, Lake Peigneur looked innocent. It was shallow, averaging only 3 to 5 feet deep. You could stand in the middle of it and the water would barely reach your chest. But the lake was hiding a secret. It sat directly on top of the Jefferson Island Salt Dome. Think of it as a massive pillar of solid salt rising from the depths of the earth, 5 miles high and a mile wide. Inside this pillar, the Diamond Crystal Salt Company had built a city, a labyrinth of tunnels as wide as 4-lane highways, holding a cathedral of white crystal. For decades, it was safe. The miners knew exactly where they were. But in 1980, the energy crisis was at its peak. Oil was gold, and Texaco wanted a piece of it. They suspected that black gold was sitting right next to the white salt. Texaco contracted a rig, Rig 20, to punch a hole in the lake bed. The plan was simple: drill down, miss the salt dome, and hit the oil pocket alongside it. But there was a problem: a ghost in the machine. The engineers were using a chart with the transverse Mercator projection, but the coordinate system they referenced was based on a different grid. It was a subtle mistake, a matter of triangulation. They thought they were aiming for the oil. In reality, they were aiming their 14-inch drill bit directly at the ceiling of the mine. The fuse was lit. They just didn't know it yet. Before we descend into the chaos, if you enjoy uncovering the dark side of engineering history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us dig deeper into the archives to bring you these stories. Now, back to the lake. It was 7:30 in the morning. On the surface of Rig 20, the crew felt a sudden, violent shudder. The drill, which had been chewing through the earth at a steady pace, suddenly seized up. It was stuck fast at a depth of about 1,200 feet. The workers did what they always did. They throttled the engines, trying to muscle the drill bit free. They pulled, they twisted, but the earth refused to let go. Then they heard it, a series of loud metallic pops echoing from below the water. It wasn't the sound of machinery working. It was the sound of the lake bed giving way. Slowly, terrifyingly, the massive drilling rig began to tilt. The captain didn't hesitate. He screamed for an immediate evacuation. The crew scrambled off the platform and leaped onto a nearby supply barge. They cut the ropes and pushed away, engines roaring, fighting to put distance between themselves and the rig. They looked back, expecting to see the rig settle into the mud. After all, the lake was only a few feet deep. The rig was a skyscraper compared to the water level. But what they saw defied logic. The massive steel structure didn't just tip over, it was swallowed. In slow motion, the derrick, the engines, the living quarters, everything slipped beneath the surface and vanished completely. The water was 3 feet deep, the rig was 150 feet tall, and yet it was gone. What the crew couldn't see was the nightmare unfolding underwater. This is where simple chemistry became a weapon of mass destruction. You see, you can't dissolve rock with water,
but you can dissolve salt. When that 14-inch drill bit punctured the ceiling of the mine, it didn't just create a leak, it created a high-pressure injection of fresh water into a salt chamber. Fresh water dissolves salt instantly. As the water rushed in, it ate away the walls of the hole. The 14-inch puncture became a 2-foot hole, then 10 feet, then 50. It was a runaway chain reaction. The more water entered, the faster the salt dissolved, and the bigger the hole became. The lake was no longer sitting on a solid lid. It was pouring into a ravenous, expanding throat. A giant whirlpool began to form on the surface, a vortex of death that started rotating faster and faster, pulling the water with the force of a jet engine. But the true horror was happening 400 meters below. At 8 a.m., Junius Gaddison, an electrician deep inside the mine, was working on a routine repair. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Then, a low, thundering vibration shook the floor beneath his boots. He stopped. The mine was usually silent, save for the distant hum of conveyor belts. But this was different. This was the sound of the earth screaming. Then came the wind. As millions of gallons of water forced their way into the mine, the air inside had nowhere to go. It was being compressed and pushed out through the ventilation shafts with hurricane force. A voice crackled over the emergency radio. It was a single command that chills the blood of any miner. Evacuate, now! The lights went out, and the race against the Atlantic Ocean began.
Down in the mines, chaos reigned, but it was a disciplined chaos. These were veteran miners. They knew that panic would kill them faster than the water. They raced toward the main shaft in trucks and on foot. The wind howling through the tunnels was deafening. It wasn't just a breeze, it was a hurricane created by the displacement of air. As millions of gallons of water flooded the lower levels, the air was being pushed up and out with enough force to knock a grown man off his feet. When they reached the elevator shaft, their hearts sank. The lift was a small metal cage designed to carry 8 men at a time. There were 55 of them waiting in the dark, and the water was rising behind them. The hoist operator, a man whose name deserves to be remembered, stayed at his post. He dropped the cage into the abyss, blind. 8 men piled in. The signal was given. The cage shot up, then down again. 8 more men, up, down. It was an agonizingly slow process. With every trip, the roar of the water got louder. The wind shook the heavy steel cage, banging it violently against the limestone walls of the shaft as it ascended. For the men waiting at the bottom, every second felt like an hour. They watched the water creep over their boots. They knew that if the power grid on the surface failed, if the salt water shorted out the electrical lines, the lift would stop, and they would be entombed forever. Miraculously, the cage made its final descent. The last group of men scrambled inside. As they rose toward the sunlight, the mine below them was fully surrendered to the flood. They made it out with only minutes to spare. But as they stepped out onto the surface, they didn't find safety. They found an apocalypse. The vortex in the center of the lake had grown into a monster. It was now a quarter-mile wide. The centrifugal force was so powerful, it was pulling the surrounding landscape apart. The beautiful Rip Van Winkle gardens, which sat on the edge of the lake, began to crack. Tourists watched in horror as the ground beneath them liquefied. 65 acres of land, massive oak trees, greenhouses, and vehicles simply slid into the muddy water. A newly built home worth hundreds of thousands of dollars groaned as its foundation snapped. In one smooth, terrifying motion, the entire house slid down the embankment and vanished into the whirlpool. But the most surreal sight was on the water itself. There were 11 massive barges on the lake that day. These were heavy industrial vessels, weighing hundreds of tons each. To the vortex, they were nothing more than rubber ducks in a bathtub drain.
One by one, the current grabbed them. They spun helplessly, picking up speed until they reached the center. The suction was so violent that the barges were pulled vertical. They stood straight up in the air for a split second before being sucked down into the mine shaft below. The lake was eating everything, and it wasn't done yet. It was about to do something that geography said was impossible. It was about to reverse a river.
The Delcambre Canal is a waterway that normally flows south, draining fresh water from Lake Peigneur into the Gulf of Mexico. But on that afternoon, the laws of physics seemed to break. As the mine below sucked the lake dry, the water level dropped so low that the canal changed direction. The Atlantic Ocean began to pour into the hole. Fishermen in the canal fought a losing battle. They watched in disbelief as the current reversed, dragging their boats inland against the roar of their engines. They were fighting the entire Gulf of Mexico. At the point where the canal met the empty lakebed, a temporary wonder of the world was created. A massive waterfall, 150 feet high, formed out of nowhere. For 2 days, salt water cascaded into the crater with the force of 1,000 fire hoses. It was the highest waterfall in the state of Louisiana, and it shouldn't have existed. It took 2 days for the pressure to equalize, 2 days for the mine to fill completely. When the water finally calmed, the lake was changed forever. But the surrealism wasn't over. A few days later, the lake burped. Due to the immense air pressure trapped in the flooded shafts, 9 of the 11 sunken barges shot back up to the surface like corks. They bobbed on the water, battered and twisted, ghostly evidence of the violence that had occurred. In the end, miraculously, no human lives were lost, but the ecosystem paid the ultimate price. Lake Peigneur was no longer a freshwater paradise. The salt water from the Gulf had permanently turned it brackish. The frogs and catfish died, replaced by ocean species. The depth of the lake changed from a shallow 3 feet to a jagged, deep crater of over 1,000 feet in some places. Then came the lawyers. In the aftermath, the finger-pointing began. Texaco and the drilling contractor eventually agreed to pay $32 million to the Diamond Crystal Salt Company and another $12 million to the Botanical Gardens for the lost land. It was an expensive settlement to close the book on a disaster caused by a simple error in triangulation. A map, a pencil, a wrong calculation. Today, if you visit Lake Peigneur, it looks peaceful. The water ripples gently under the sun, but the locals know the truth. They know that beneath that calm surface lies a drowned industrial city, miles of tunnels filled with dark water, and the wreckage of a drilling rig that dared to punch a hole in the earth. It serves as a silent monument to a terrifying truth. Our engineering is fragile. We build, we drill, and we conquer, but nature always has the final say. This story is a reminder of how quickly our world can turn upside down due to a single mistake. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think this was purely human negligence, or is this the inevitable cost of our hunger for resources? Who is really to blame here? If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. We have more stories of engineering disasters and survival coming soon. Until next time, stay safe.